Well, hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Home in Progress by Repco Light Paint, sponsored by Benjamin Moore, and I'm back, officially back, from vacation. The last week was a repeated episode. I think the week before that was a repeated episode. Sorry about all of that, but I just ran out of time. But I'm back, and I'm ready for new stuff. Brilliant, amazing new stuff. But before I get to all of that, I do want to tell you something funny from my vacation. It's funny. It's probably too long of a story, but it's funny. It was embarrassing at the time, but it's funny in retrospect. Anyway, we're up north, on our vacation. We're up north in a cottage on Burt Lake. If you're not familiar, Burt Lake is about 20 minutes south of Mackinac City. That doesn't really matter a whole lot for the story, but at least it puts it in your mind so you can place it. We do this vacation every single year. We go to that same cabin every single year. And because of that, we know that the lake there, Burt Lake, right where we're swimming at least, that sometimes gives us swimmer's itch. Swimmer's itch. And in case you didn't know what that is, or you don't know what that is, swimmer's itch is an itchy skin rash caused by an allergic reaction to a tiny microscopic parasite that's in the water. Lots and lots of tiny microscopic parasites cause all this itching. It's pretty miserable, but usually it's not all that bad. Now, there's more to what's going on with swimmer's itch, but who cares? You don't need to know that. Gives you an idea. That's all you need to know. It usually ends up looking like little mosquito bites on your legs. If you look online, you'll see all kinds of horror story pictures on Google. That's what I always expected with swimmer's itch. It turns out to be, maybe 10 or 15 little dots on my legs, at the end of a week. Usually, that's usually what happens. The lake gives us that, like I said, from time to time. But we found that if you scrub off with a towel and if you shower and wash well after swimming, it's usually no big deal. So we know about it, but we don't freak out about it. Oh, we also did learn over the years that spraying your legs down with a waterproof sunscreen, that also seems to help. Before you go in the water, if you do that, that seems to help. I guess it makes it harder for the little parasites to get to your skin. I'm not sure on the old science with that, but that's our working theory. Anyway, none of that is funny yet. I know, I'm getting there. One of the times that we went swimming this year, I left the sunscreen off my legs. I don't remember why. Doesn't matter, but I skipped it. And I went into the water, and like 40 minutes later, my legs are itching in the water. That's never happened before, but they're itching really badly. And I go out, I scrub off, I do my shower thing thinking that's going to resolve this, but it doesn't. In fact, like a half an hour after that, my legs feel like they're on fire. It's not pain, it's just incredible itchiness. It was absolutely miserable. It was the worst thing I can ever think I've endured. It felt like I had a million ants crawling up and down my legs. It was truly, truly horrible. So I flew down to the nearest little, store, and I snatched up $60 worth of anti-itch creams and sprays and whatnot. Everything that I thought might help. I just went with my arms full of these things and piled it all on the counter. And as I stand there, pushing these things at the sales clerk, I'm twisting, I'm twitching. I don't even know what my face looked like. My eyes are probably watering. It was horrible. As I do that, I get this clerk who absolutely only wants to talk. This guy sees me and his face lights up. Maybe he hasn't talked to anybody all day or all week or all month so far. I don't know. But he latched on to me and he's just talking about everything I've got. Oh, calamine spray. I've used that. And then the next thing he grabs, cortisone cream. Looks like you've got some kind of itchy rash. Do you have an itchy rash? He is trying to start a million conversations. He's loud. Everybody's looking at him. And this goes on and on and on. And then, as if that's not bad enough, we had to price check things. The witch hazel, the Epsom salts, because I grabbed everything that I thought might possibly help. He's price checking stuff. He's hollering things out. It was horrible. It took forever. I was squirming. I was dying inside. I was trying to be polite, but I just had to get outside and lather myself in cream, and he wouldn't stop talking about the time he got poison ivy, for example, when he was 5. Or was it when he was 7? Was it back at his grandma's house or was it at his parents' cottage? He can't remember. Finally, mercifully, it all ended, and I left. I started applying the goodies that I bought, and after about 2 hours, some relief finally set in. 4 hours more, and I was feeling pretty good again. I was recovering from it, but it was a long afternoon and early evening, that's for sure. Okay, so all of that happened. Still not the funny part. Flash forward a day. I'm still gun shy. I don't want to go in the water. I'm nervous about it. And then I see a couple of new families show up, and the two dads take all the kids down to the water, and all of them go swimming in the shallowest, most swimmers' itchiest parts of the lake. For nearly an hour, they're in there. And at one point, it registers that if I don't warn them, if I, Dan Hansen, don't warn them, those poor kids and dads are going to be miserable like I was. Now, I know my inabilities. I've talked about them on the show. I've got social inabilities. I can do the radio thing because I'm sitting in a studio by myself. I can fake it then. I can do it then. But social engagements with when people are there and it's all live and it's all really happening, they are not my thing. I'm clumsy. I'm awkward. I almost always turn social interactions into hilarious train wrecks. Hilarious for the kids, embarrassing for me. I knew that, but I couldn't let these people suffer, right? I have to do it. I have to warn them. This is so silly. Most of you would just handle it, right? This isn't even a story for most people. For 95% of the populace, this isn't even a story. For me, it was an epic quest. So I'm sitting out there watching, and I'm waiting for the right moment when the dads, get on the dock. And there's this long, narrow dock that leads out to the swimming area, and they're heading back to their cabin. I figured this was the perfect time to catch them. I'll just go wait for them, and I'll catch them. So as I'm heading that way, I'm rehearsing what I'm going to say. And I'd already rehearsed it. That's another thing I do. I rehearse all this stuff. And I think that's the problem. That's part of the problem, because once I get off script, once I start saying something that wasn't part of my rehearsed, monologue or message, I can't get back to it, and I just spiral into chaos. But anyway, I'm walking towards them. I'm rehearsing what I'm going to say, and then when I get to the end of the dock, expecting them to have met me there, I find that they've stopped in the middle to look at something. Well, I started down the dock to kind of meet them, but then I stopped part way when they looked at me and thought, I could see in their eyes, they thought I was trying to get past them to the water. And we all stared at each other at that point because we all knew I couldn't get past them. They were on the larger side, no judgment, but they were on the larger side. And the dock is really, really narrow. And so somebody's going to fall in the water if I try to get past them. So we just stare at each other. And it's kind of a standoff. And that's the first awkward moment that happens in this. And I could feel it, and I knew this was a really bad omen. But I thought I'd alleviate this. I'll just propel myself past this awkwardness and get to my message, and I'd make everything good. So I shouted at them, across the 20 feet or so between us, and I said, I'm not trying to get past you. Nope. I just am waiting for you to come to me. Well, I could tell by the look on their faces that my wording didn't make a lot of sense to them. They had no idea what I was after. They're just thinking, what does this weird little guy want from us? Why do we got to go to him? And I knew the minute I said it, it was awkward. So I tried to fix awkward moment number 2 by saying, I have a message for you. Idiotic. I have no idea what my brain is doing. I guess I was just in that all too familiar death spiral of all of my social interactions, or most of them. It's never all of them. I can do it sometimes. Most of them death spiral like this. And I was in that death spiral, and I knew it at that point. I knew how it was going to go, from this moment on. But for the sake of their children, I plunged ahead because I'm noble like that. Anyway, I walked up to the guys, right? I look them both in the eyes, and literally, and for whatever reason, again, I can't explain it, I lifted my leg way in the air, and then I pulled my shorts, the shorts leg, way high, and I said, I have swimmer's itch all over me, swimmer's itch. Their eyes, oh my goodness, I wish I had had a video I probably wouldn't want a video, but I kind of would like a video of this moment so I could show people what I saw in their faces. I will remember it forever. They just stared at me. Their eyes started to water. They were stunned. They were shocked. They were confused. I think they thought it was a little funny. I think they were a little nervous at first because I seemed unstable. I'm sure I seemed unstable. But now when I lifted up my leg and showed them the dots on my leg, or the little swimmer's itch marks or spots, I could tell that they realized I was harmless, but they figured I was quite eccentric. So they just nodded, right? They nodded. And I just kept going. So I pointed at the water and I said, swimmer's itch. And then I pointed at my legs again. And then I nodded at the men very gravely. Point at the water, point at my legs, swimmer's itch. And I figured that we're communicating. I knew I was messing this up big time. They're just nodding. They're trying to be polite. It was surreal. My brain literally was shutting down, or had shut down. It left, flipped the lights off, and left. I knew I was doing so badly in this interaction, and all I had really wanted to do was warn them. So I tried one more time, because I hadn't gotten my message across yet. I told them, it's really bad this year. The swimmer's itch in the water is really bad. I don't normally get it this bad, but I did. I just didn't want your kids to get it. It's miserable. So be sure to have them scrub up really good after. That's all. Finally, it worked, right? It worked. I did it right. I did well. I saved the interaction. I got my message across. The point registered. I could tell in their eyes. And they finally understood what I was trying to do. So they said thanks. They smiled and they nodded. And I should have left. Don't know why I didn't leave. Don't know why. I wish I'd left. But instead, I thought somehow more needed to be said. So I held up my leg again. And I said, I've been lathering up my legs with Vaseline before swimming. And then I went on to tell them, it feels weird, but not as weird as you might think. And it seems to help. Man, their faces, utterly frozen. They were utterly frozen. It looked like a movie that somebody hit pause on. I don't think they blinked. I don't think their hair moved in the breeze even. They were just frozen. And finally, at that point, my brain said, please, let us leave this place. And my body started to obey, finally. And I turned around and I walked, or slunk, back to the cabin. This was like Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday afternoon on our week-long vacation. I had the entire rest of the week to spend at this place with these people, and I knew they were going to be wondering about me all the entire time. Anyway, the Vaseline really does work, and it really isn't as weird, feeling as you think. I had all my kids, they were using it because nobody wanted the swimmer's itch, and nobody got anything after that fact. And it turns out I think those people were fine too, and I think they thought I was kind of just that lovable eccentric that happens to vacation there from time to time. I think it all ended well. But I have no idea why I shut down mentally when I have social interactions, but it happens all the time. And at this point in my life, just try to roll with it. And I find whatever joy or fun I can, and I just pull that out of those interactions and those situations, because really that's all I've got. I know I'm going to mess it up. I might as well enjoy it. All right, enough of that. Way too long, but I thought it was kind of fun. It's a good way to break in after vacation. All right, have you ever heard of Hoosier cabinets? Hoosier, as in, Hoosiers with Gene Hackman, the movie. Hoosiers like that. Have you ever heard of Hoosier cabinets? Well, I just learned about them, and I think they're the coolest things. They're the coolest things ever. I'm going to tell you why right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by Repco Light Paints and Benjamin Moore. People often think of paint as just another line item on the project supply list. But here's the thing. Everything you do, every hour of prep, every stroke of the brush, all comes down to the quality of the paint. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repco Light Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And let's talk about Hoosier cabinets. And to get started, I'm going to describe a couple of key points of one of these things. And I just want you to decide in your brain whether you think this was something really old, from the early 1900s, or does it sound like something that's pretty modern? Now, it is really old. I'll tell you that right off the bat. But just decide if it sounds old or if it sounds like cool new stuff. All right, Hoosier cabinets. They were about 4 feet wide, they were roughly 6 feet tall, and they were a furniture piece, freestanding. They had lower cabinets, a counter area, and then another set of upper cabinets that are a little bit shallower than the base. So can you picture that? Nothing fancy. But here's just one really cool thing about this type of furniture piece. The counter area that I mentioned, it slides out, okay? So it's sitting there. When it's pushed in, it's just sitting there and you've got a nice work surface to work on. But if you need more work surface, more counter space, you can just pull it out and instantly you get another 6 to 8 inches right when you need it. That is really, really clever. The part that really gets me is that the drawers that are directly underneath that counter, they move with it. When you see pictures of these things, you assume that the drawers are going to be left behind and below that countertop when you pull it out. But that's not how it works. When you pull the counter out towards you, the drawers come along for the ride, which means the stuff that you need in those drawers is never, ever buried behind the spot where you happen to be standing. Those are just a couple of the main selling points of these Hoosier cabinets. And even though, at least to me, the design features feel incredibly modern and incredibly brilliant and incredibly clever, these were actually in place way back at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s. They came about and popular through the 20s, 30s, something like that. So let's talk about them for a little bit, and I'm pretty sure by the time I'm done, you're going to want one. I bet I can convince 25 to 60%. I mean, what a ridiculous range. 25 to 60%. Let's be bold. I feel I can convince 50 to 60% of you that you're going to want one. You may not get one, but you're going to want one. Okay, when they came out, these things came out early, 1900s, late 1890s, I think they were first made. They start to hit, stores and stuff like that, early 1900s. And as the years go by, they catch on like wildfire. Even though they could be a little pricey for the time period, almost everybody wanted one. And millions of people brought them into their homes. And all of that happened because for most of American history, this is kind of news. This is kind of, well, I don't know if it's news for you. It was news for me and it's interesting. But for most of American history, up until that point, and through this point for a little bit, kitchens were nearly empty rooms. It's not what we think of as a kitchen. That's not what older kitchens were like. You basically had a work table, you had a sink, maybe a cupboard, and a few open shelves, and that was about it. Built-in cabinetry existed, it was around, but it was pretty much a luxury. It meant hiring a skilled carpenter to come and build furniture right into the house, and most people couldn't afford that. Built-in cabinets didn't really become a standard in American kitchens until the late 1920s. So for a good long time, the average kitchen had no counters, no cabinets in any sense that we'd recognize. And that meant that the things that you used every day, flour, sugar, dry goods, bowls, baking powder, all of those things were scattered around the kitchen or stored in a pantry. So every time you baked, you had to walk. Out to the pantry for flour, back to the table, across to the shelf for a bowl, back to the pantry because you forgot the baking powder. Loads of back and forth just to do a basic daily task. And then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Hoosier cabinets start showing up, and they're marketed as cabinets that can save you 1,000 steps. And that idea catches on because whether the number was literally 1,000 or not, the cabinet really did save an incredible amount of work. I mean, these things are really, really amazing. It didn't replace the pantry, but what it did do was pull the everyday baking supplies out of the pantry and it put them all inside one workstation. 50 pounds of flour right there, sugar right there, rolling pins, bread knives, cutting boards, spice racks, all of it right there, along with that pull-out counter to work on. Everything you needed for the basic daily kitchen jobs of the time was concentrated in one small space. That's why they caught on. That's part of why they're so cool, but there's so much more to say. We're going to talk about the great features that they offered, just tons of features, the reason for the name, Hoosier cabinets, and the resurgence that they're seeing, right now in our day and age. And we'll do all of that right after this. Home in Progress is brought to you by Repcolite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Think about it. You spend hours prepping, sanding, taping, and then finally painting. Don't throw all that work away with an inferior product. The paint isn't just another supply. The paint is the project. Make sure it's the best. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repco Light Paints and sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we're talking about Hoosier cabinets. Not Who's Your cabinets, but Hoosier cabinets, like the movie, like the Gene Hackman movie, like Indiana, Hoosiers. Hoosier cabinets. They're a kitchen storage solution from the early 1900s, and they are still incredibly clever and inspiring even now, even today in 2026. And before I go too much further into all that I want to talk about, I want to walk through one of these things from, front to back so you can get a mental image of what we're talking about. And if you're able to, just Google Hoosier cabinets, Hoosier cabinets. Google that. Take a look at some pictures. I've also got a fun video in the show notes of a lady walking you through why she loves hers. It's 12 minutes. It's sometimes, a couple of times maybe a little repetitive, but it's a really fun video. She'll sell you on them even better than I am doing here. So you can find that in the show notes. Just go to repcolite.com. You'll find it right there. But here's the basic layout. You've got a wide lower cabinet that sits on the floor. It's the deepest part of the whole thing. It's usually sitting on casters. Above that is the work surface, that little countertop that I talked about that will slide out. And then above that, kind of mounted on that in some way, because that counter will slide out. So mounted on that in such a way that it doesn't impede that, you've got shallower upper cabinets. You've still got room underneath them to work. And quite often in that area, directly above that counter, you've got a little roll top section that gives you easy access to counter level storage. Again, storage that isn't affected by the counter rolling out. So it must sit on something just above that rolling counter or that sliding counter. But anyway, you've got a little shelf area there that's kind of counter level that you can fill with stuff, and then you can just hide it all with this little roll top divider that keeps that clutter out of sight when you're not working. That's the basic look, and it's all one piece. Now let's look at the details, starting with that work surface again. Now, I've already mentioned a couple times the pull-out counter and the traveling drawers, but that counter, it's often a porcelain enamel or a zinc. It's durable, it's wipeable, it's meant to be worked on really hard, it's really long-lasting. So that's what that material is on that counter. And then above that counter, behind one of those upper cabinet doors, again, if you get pictures, this will all make a lot more sense. It's radio, and I'm still a newbie at all of this, so I'm probably not doing a good job of describing it. But behind one of those upper cabinet doors, a lot of Hoosier cabinets have this large flour bin. This great big bin, and it's for storing flour in. And beneath or at the bottom of that bin, it kind of looks like a big chute. And at the bottom of it, there's a built-in sifter and dispenser. So instead of hauling out a sack of flour or digging around in a big bin with a scoop, you just slide your bowl underneath it, turn a crank, and sifted flour drops right where you need it. And many of them also had a sugar bin working on basically the same idea, often on the other side, behind one of the other upper cabinet doors. So that's really, really cool. Really, really cool. Then you've got the doors themselves. If you open the upper or the lower doors, the backs of the doors are working storage. Not an inch of space is wasted in these things. Everything is just engineered perfectly to make the most out of all the space that you've got, give you the most storage and the most practical storage. So on the backs of all these doors, all these cabinet doors, you've got spice racks, you've got cookbook holders, you've got racks for pie tins, you've got hooks along the sides. There's essentially no wasted area anywhere. Every surface is doing something. Down by, in the wider lower cabinet, when you open those doors, you'll often find a low shelf that slides out for pan storage. And most of them, I guess I can't say most of them, a number of them, a lot of them, that kind of slide out thing is automatic. You open the doors and it kind of just gently rolls out, not in your way, but right into, just an easy access position. So you're not going to have to be laying on the floor, crawling around with a flashlight looking for pans or whatever, like I have to do at all my lower cabinets. The shelf rolls out. And I know a lot of modern shelves will do this, but this was happening, again, back in 1900s. They had this built in. So cool. Then add in all the other little nooks and crannies that are built into these things for storage, and you see how amazingly clever and practical this could be. And all of it is packed into a piece of furniture that's taking up literally, 4 feet of wall space. It's 4 feet wide. It's proof that a small footprint, if that's what you're working with, it's not necessarily a limitation. It's a design constraint, that's for sure, but constraints make people clever if you will actually embrace and, meet that constraint head on. So if you've got a small room somewhere or just a small space and you've struggled with the fact and, bemoaned the fact that this is just too tiny of an area for what you need, it could be. This isn't magic, but check out these Hoosier cabinets and who knows? A little bit of cleverness, a little bit of a different idea, a different way to use some of the space, and you might find you've got all the room you need and then some. Anyway, that gives you kind of a ballpark idea of what they look like. Now let's talk briefly about the name, Hoosier cabinets, and I want to talk about who invented them. And as to that part, the inventor, that one's easy. Nobody seems to know for sure exactly who invented them. You can find patents for kitchen cabinets going back to about 1885. And what seems to have happened is that a bunch of Indiana furniture companies landed on the same idea around that same time. A bunch of them. According to the museum in Napanee, Indiana, which has one of the best collections of these Hoosier cabinets in the country, according to them, no one person and no one company gets the credit. So there's a lot of claims, a lot of companies will take the credit, but according to kind of an impartial historical source, they're kind of saying, hey, we can't really pin it down to any one person or any one company. What we do know is the scale. We know that there are basically 130 or so different companies that were building versions of this cabinet, in the time period that they were really popular. We can track them down. We can see them through newspaper ads, through sales listings, and basically just walking through antique malls and looking at what's actually out there. Most of the companies who were building these were in Indiana. Some of them were in Ohio and around the Midwest, but most of them were located in Indiana. Now, the biggest company making these was the Hoosier Manufacturing Company in Newcastle, Indiana. They were the loudest advertiser, and that's why their name, in a lot of people believe that their name is what became the generic term for the whole category of these cabinets. Basically the same way every tissue became a Kleenex. Every one of these types of cabinets became a Hoosier cabinet, possibly because of the Hoosier Manufacturing Company. That's one of the claims, but even that claim is contested. Some people argue that it's just because they came from Indiana. The Hoosiers. It came from Indiana. That's why they're Hoosier cabinets. Either way, they took off, as we already discussed, and eventually 1 in 10 kitchens had one. And that may not sound like a ton, but it's a big deal considering the price and the time frame that they were really popular. All right. So if they were so cool and all of that, where did they go? What happened to them? Well, the answer is really, really simple, really obvious. Built-in cabinets came about. They became more popular and they became kind of the standard in kitchens. By the late 1920s, houses were getting built with real cabinets worked in, continuous countertops, and a freestanding cabinet suddenly just really couldn't compete with a whole wall of storage. That's part of it. Another part is that these cabinets sat on legs. They were furniture. And furniture on legs can be hard to clean underneath. Dust, grease, all of that collects in that open space below, and it's just a pain to get at. Built-ins won partly on being brilliant and partly on just being easier to keep clean. And to combat this decline in people wanting these cabinets, the Hoosier Cabinet Company started coming out with prettier patterns, brighter colors. One company offered their basic cabinet in a vaguely Mediterranean styling, but none of that worked. By 1935, the Hoosier cabinet was considered old-fashioned, and Hoosier Manufacturing was sold off. That company, that big company that we talked about, sold off and liquidated in 1942. So you'd think that was the end of these cabinets, that they faded into the sunset of history at that point. But they didn't, because they're so cool. Hoosier cabinets are having a resurgence. People are seeing the value, the appeal, and they're snatching them up. Either old oak cabinets that need work, they can be found for a few $100 or so, depending. You can find them. Or you can also find fully restored ones, cleaned up, refinished. The hardware's all sorted out. And those are going to start around $1,100 and average closer to $1,800 or so. But you can find them all over the place in all different conditions. You can also find plans online, including some from Popular Woodworking and other sites like that regarding on how to build your own. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, again, you've just got to look at them a little bit. And I think one of the best ways to get a really good tour of them is to check out that video that I mentioned earlier in the segment. The lady that walks you through her cabinet shows you all the different things she does with it. She uses it for baking, and it's absolutely perfect. She's just remodeled her entire kitchen, all new cabinets and everything. And she says that this old Hoosier cabinet that she's got is the one place in her kitchen that absolutely works flawlessly. Even with the new kitchen design, that's not as good as this Hoosier cabinet for what she's trying to do. So those are Hoosier cabinets, and I've got to confess, I'd never heard of them before, so I was really intrigued when I ran into them, and I decided to make a segment out of them. Now, what I want to do is take a break, and when we come back, I want to pull 4, 5, 6 design principles out of these Hoosier cabinets and take them and apply them to pretty much any project you tackle in your home, any remodeling or reorganizing project. There's a lot of good stuff in these cabinets that we can apply to other things. We're going to do that right after this. You're listening to Home in Progress, where the projects are real, the mistakes, they're educational, sometimes painful, mostly educational, and the only thing more stubborn than that old wallpaper on your bathroom wall is your determination to get it fixed. Proudly sponsored by Repcolite Paints and Benjamin Moore. Paint with a purpose, people who care, and everything you need to get the job done right. And we're back. You're listening to Home in Progress by Repcolite Paints, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we've been talking about Hoosier cabinets. Hoosier, Hoosier cabinets. And I know most of you aren't going to go rushing out to buy one, and that's fine. But I've been thinking about that cabinet for a while now, and I keep coming back to the fact that whoever designed it understood some design principles that we often forget. They're not unattainable design principles. Some of them are common sense, but we, tend to overlook them, to forget them. Here are 4 of them. 4 design principles pulled straight out of that cabinet that apply to pretty much any project that you can take on in your home. Your garage, your closet, your laundry room, your bathroom, your workbench, the cupboard under your sink, any space in your home, these will apply. All right, the first principle that I want to cover is this. Name the one job that the space is supposed to do, and then let the job do the cutting. What I mean is, the Hoosier cabinet, it wasn't a kitchen. It knew that, and it didn't try to be a kitchen. It was a baking and a prep station. That's it. That's what it was for. It didn't hold the good china. It didn't hold the roasting pan that you use twice a year. It didn't hold the canned goods. Those were for the pantry. The cabinet had one purpose, and the items in it all served that goal. Now, here's the slightly broader homeowner version of this. And I think it could be really useful, for some people more than others. But generally speaking, stuff drifts into a room. It happens over years. Somebody sets something down at one point and it stays. It gets moved to a shelf maybe because it was in the way. It gets set over here. And then that's just where that thing is kept from that point on. Nobody ever decided that it belonged there. It's kind of like a squatter. It just arrived and never ended up leaving. And over time, we kind of become blind to it. We don't even think about it. We just kind of, that's where it is, and, that's that. For example, that maybe doesn't make sense, but go stand in your laundry room right now and take a look at what's on the shelves. Or check out the storage shelves in your garage or the cleaning cupboard or your workbench or whatever. Check out those different areas, and I bet you're going to find things that really don't belong there when you really think about it. You may not see it at first, but look it over. Think about what you use that place for, and do these things belong here? I've got things in my laundry room on the shelves there that are taking up space that really, at the end of the day have nothing to do with laundry. They just arrived one day and they never left, and I don't even think about them. Same thing in the cleaning cupboard. And all of those things take up space from items that could be there, that should be there. So the first move in any space isn't buying, more storage materials or whatever, expanding your area, putting shelves higher and higher. The first thing is just naming the job that the room or the area is trying to accomplish, and then getting rid of all the things that don't serve that job. It costs nothing. It's a great first step, and you'll often gain a lot of storage or some storage or workspace when you move the things to better homes. You're going to gain that for free. So start with that. That's the first principle. The second principle is related. Once you've named the job that the area is for, get everything that the job needs within reach of the one spot. First principle, get the things that don't apply to the job out of the spot, name the spot and get the stuff that doesn't apply out of it. This one, get everything that you need within reach of the spot. The promise of the Hoosier cabinet was this: pull up a chair and don't get up again. It's going to save you 1,000 steps. Everything you need for the work that you're going to do at that, workstation is inside the sweep of your arms. The flour is right there. You don't even have to get up from your chair to get it. There's a dispenser. You just turn the crank. There it is. The sugar's right there. The spices are on the door, the bowls and all of that stuff. It's kind of near your feet, It's right down there. You're not walking anywhere to get this stuff. So tonight, maybe, count your steps while you're making dinner. How many times do you walk away from the counter that you're working at to go to the pantry, to the far drawer, to the cabinet over the fridge, whatever? Each time you wander off to get something that you need is a potential design weakness in the layout of your space. Something that you might be able to fix and something that can make a job like food prep or whatever, again, make it easier, make it more enjoyable. Now, can you always fix it? Of course not. You can't always fix it. But in my kitchen, for example, I waste a ton of steps. And when I look at where I'm storing things, I can see that I'm not storing things based on where I will use them. I'm just storing them based off, I think I'm basing it on how the kitchen drawers and cupboards were laid out in the house that I grew up in. It's just kind of a default position. It just seems like that's the drawer for this stuff. Is it the best place for that particular, group of stuff? Maybe not, but that's where I'm putting it. So look your space over with that in mind and try to get the items for given tasks all within arm's reach. And if you're designing a space or completely remodeling, something, don't forget this point. Keep it front and center in your mind when you work out the placement of new cabinets or whatever. The third principle is this: use the space that you've got creatively. Go back to the Hoosier cabinets in your mind and picture the doors. Every door interior, the inside of the door, is doing work. Spice racks are mounted right to the door, a cookbook holder, racks for pie tins, whatever. Some of them even had charts printed inside, with baking times and measurements and all of that on it. There's essentially no wasted area in these cabinets. Every surface is carrying something or serving some purpose. Now for me, maybe for you, but for sure for me, my storage problems usually aren't entirely or completely square footage issues. My main storage problems is that I'm usually using only part of the available space. Open a kitchen cabinet and look at the shelf, for example, with the spice, bottles in it. Now that shelf is set at a height for cereal boxes a lot of the times. So above those, 3-inch or whatever spice jars, there are 8 inches or whatever of dead air, wasted space. If you've got those little tiered racks, a lot of us have those little tiered spice racks, that makes it better. But under the back spices, the back of that rack, there's still empty space. Is there a way to create a storage solution that would still allow you quick access to those spices without wasting that space? What about taking a page out of the Hoosier cabinet playbook and just mounting a spice rack on the inside of the door? Could I make that work? Could you make that work? That's just one example of what I'm getting at. I've got that going on all over the place in my home, areas where I'm just not taking advantage, full advantage, creative advantage of the space that I've got. I'm sure you have the same thing as well. All right, fourth principle, the last principle: borrow the space, then give it back. Hoosier cabinets, they had that pull-out counter. I love that so much. You pull it out, you gain 6 or 8 inches of counter workspace, but that's only half of the genius of it. When you'd rather have the walkway than the counter, you just push the counter back in. So cool, so smart. Space doesn't have to be permanent to be useful. So ask yourself, where am I short on space? Only sometimes. In those areas, you don't need permanent square footage solutions. You need space that shows up on demand. Now, what does this look like? It seems like pie in the sky. But the laundry room, it's a great example, an easy example in the house. You need usually a big flat surface to fold clothes on. And you usually need that for about 11 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever a few times a week. The rest of the time, you need to be able to walk through the room. So a fold-down surface that's hinged to the wall above, the washer and dryer solves all your problems. It can cost about $40 and take you an afternoon's worth of time. and you can give yourself that folding surface when you need it, but it can fold away when you want to have that space for something else. The same kind of thing could apply to a workbench in a garage. Hinge it against the back wall and flip it up when you don't need it. You get the idea. The biggest point is to remember the Hoosier cabinets accomplished a ton of heavy lifting in terms of storage and practicality in a 4-foot wide footprint. So lack of space isn't the biggest problem that we encounter. It's a design constraint for sure, but constraints can bring out our most clever, most ingenious solutions if we tackle them head on and with some creativity. So see what you can do in your space. All right, that's going to do it. If you want to catch this episode again, you can find it online at repcolite.com. Whatever you do today, make sure paint's a part of it. Have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you next week. For Home in Progress, I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.